On the morning of Friday, October 13th, 1307, something unthinkable swept across France before most people had risen from their beds. In the quiet hours before dawn, royal messengers moved with sealed orders, breaking them open only when they reached their destinations. What followed was swift, coordinated, and merciless. Knights Templar, warriors sworn to poverty, chastity, and obedience, were seized in their commanderies, dragged from chapels and strongholds, and placed in chains. By sunset, an order that had shaped 2 centuries of crusading history appeared finished. The speed of the operation was shocking. The Templars were not rebels hiding in forests or conspirators plotting in secret. They were bankers, soldiers, and administrators woven into medieval Europe. They answered directly to the Pope, not to kings, and yet it was a king, Philip I of France, who struck them down with breathtaking efficiency. No warnings were issued. No public debates were held. The arrests came everywhere at once, as if delay itself was dangerous. Officially, the explanation seemed clear enough. The Templars, the charges claimed, had become corrupt. They were accused of heresy, of denying Christ, of obscene initiation rites, and idol worship. To a frightened public, already conditioned to fear religious deviance, these accusations sounded damning. But from the very beginning, something about the story felt wrong. Confessions were extracted under torture. Testimonies contradicted one another. Many claims rested on rumor rather than proof. What made the downfall unsettling was not only the brutality, but the silence that followed. The Vatican did not rush to defend its most powerful military order, but neither did it fully embrace the king's narrative. Instead, it hesitated, investigated quietly, and spoke in carefully measured words. By the end of that single day, the Knights Templar were no longer feared warriors or revered monks. They were prisoners, suspects, and soon ghosts. And as the shock faded, an uncomfortable question lingered. How could an order this powerful fall so completely unless forces far greater than heresy were at work? History would never stop asking what truly happened in the darkness before that infamous dawn. When the arrests were announced, Christendom was given an explanation so scandalous it seemed designed to horrify rather than convince. The Knights Templar, it was claimed, were not merely corrupt or politically inconvenient. They were heretics. According to royal prosecutors, new initiates were forced to renounce Christ, spit on the cross, and swear obedience to secret masters whose authority rivaled God himself. Even more disturbing were allegations that the order worshipped an idol known as Baphomet, a name few had ever heard and no one could clearly describe. These accusations spread quickly, repeated from pulpits and courtrooms alike, yet the details never seemed to settle into a coherent story. Some witnesses described the idol as a bearded head. Others claimed it had 3 faces, or was made of silver, or appeared only in visions. A few insisted no idol existed at all. The contradictions were obvious even to medieval observers accustomed to superstition and rumor. The supposed initiation rituals raised even more questions. Templars were accused of obscene practices that directly contradicted their rigid monastic discipline. Men who had lived under strict vows of chastity and obedience were suddenly portrayed as participants in secret blasphemies. Yet when interrogations were conducted outside France, especially in regions where torture was limited or forbidden, these confessions often vanished. The same knights who admitted guilt under pain denied everything when questioned freely. Clergy and scholars of the time noticed these inconsistencies. Heresy trials usually uncovered patterns, shared texts, coherent beliefs, recognizable doctrines. In the Templars' case, there was nothing of the sort. The charges shifted from testimony to testimony, as if molded to fit expectations rather than truth. Even Pope Clement V appeared unconvinced, ordering his own inquiries instead of accepting the king's verdict. What made the situation more troubling was the absence of physical evidence. No forbidden scriptures were produced. No idols were publicly displayed. Everything rested on words extracted under fear and suffering. For an order that had defended Christianity for generations, the accusations felt strangely hollow. And yet, despite their implausibility, they worked. The narrative of secret heresy justified extraordinary actions. But for those paying close attention, the charges raised a darker suspicion. If the crimes were so vague, perhaps the real offense lay elsewhere, hidden beneath layers of accusation no one was meant to question. After the shock of the arrests and the lurid accusations, Europe waited for the Church to speak. For nearly 2 centuries, the Knights Templar had answered only to the Pope. They wore the cross by papal decree, collected taxes with papal permission, and fought wars blessed by Rome. Logic demanded a thunderous response. Instead, what followed was hesitation. Pope Clement V did not rush to condemn the order, nor did he issue a ringing defense. His statements were cautious, almost evasive, calling for investigations, commissions, and patience. While King Philip IV shouted guilt from every court in France, the Vatican spoke in muted tones, as if weighing consequences too dangerous to name. This restraint puzzled contemporaries. It puzzles historians still. Behind closed doors, papal envoys questioned Templars privately and reached conclusions that rarely matched the royal narrative. Yet these findings were not proclaimed. No formal declaration of innocence echoed from Rome. No decisive condemnation followed either. Silence filled the space where clarity should have been. In medieval Europe, silence was not neutrality, it was a signal. Some, it suggested doubt. To others, fear. The Church had faced heresies before and responded swiftly when doctrine was threatened. Why then did it tread so carefully now? What knowledge restrained its voice? As months turned into years, the absence of a clear papal stance allowed the king's version of events to harden into accepted history. Executions continued. Properties were seized. An order dissolved without a single universal verdict. This quiet acquiescence became the heart of the mystery. If the Templars were truly heretics, why hesitate? And if they were not, why remain silent? Between condemnation and defense, the Vatican chose neither, and in that choice it left behind a question that has never stopped echoing, one that unsettles scholars, believers, and skeptics alike. The Knights Templar were something the medieval world had never seen before, and perhaps never fully understood. They were monks who took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet they trained daily for war. They prayed like clerics, lived under strict rules like monks, and killed like professional soldiers. This contradiction alone placed them outside the moral comfort zone of medieval society, where the Church preached peace while kings waged war. Founded in the aftermath of the First Crusade, the Templars were created to solve a specific problem, protecting Christian pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem. But their mission quickly expanded. They became an elite fighting force, disciplined, armored, and terrifyingly effective. Unlike feudal armies loyal to local lords, the Templars answered only to the Pope. No king could command them, no noble could tax them. This independence was not symbolic, it was absolute. To rulers across Europe, this autonomy was unsettling. The Templars owned castles within kingdoms, yet owed those kingdoms nothing. They marched armies across borders without asking permission. They operated according to a rule book written in Rome, not Paris or London. In an age where authority was everything, the idea of armed men beyond royal control was quietly alarming. What made the situation even more dangerous was public trust. Ordinary people respected the Templars. They donated land, money, and even their children to the order. In many regions, the Templars were seen as more disciplined and less corrupt than local nobility. This moral authority gave them influence kings could not easily challenge. Over time, the Templars became a state within states, a parallel power structure that functioned efficiently, loyally, and without visible ambition. Yet history shows that power without ambition is often more frightening than power that seeks a crown. For Europe's rulers, the question was no longer whether the Templars were loyal, but whether their very existence was a threat that could no longer be tolerated. The Templar swords earned them respect, but their wealth made them indispensable and dangerous. What began as donations to support a holy mission evolved into the most sophisticated financial network medieval Europe had ever known. The order accepted deposits, issued letters of credit, safeguarded treasures, and transferred funds across continents. Kings trusted them. Nobles depended on them. Even the church relied on their efficiency. Pilgrims could deposit money in Paris and withdraw it safely in Jerusalem. Monarchs stored war chests in Templar vaults. Entire regions passed into Templar control through donations and wills. Unlike secular lords, the Templars rarely squandered resources. They reinvested, expanded, and documented everything. Their commanderies functioned like branches of a continental bank. This system gave the order enormous leverage. Knowledge of debts is power, and the Templars knew exactly who owed what. They held royal crowns as collateral, relics as guarantees, and land as security. In a cash-poor medieval economy, this made them indispensable to rulers who needed immediate funds for wars and ambitions. Yet this wealth did not flow upward to kings. It flowed inward, strengthening the order's independence. Unlike nobles, the Templars did not pass wealth through bloodlines. They accumulated it institutionally. Over time, their holdings rivaled those of entire kingdoms while remaining untouchable by local taxation. This imbalance bred resentment. Kings could borrow from the Templars but could not control them. They could benefit from Templar efficiency but could not command it. When financial dependence meets political frustration, history shows that accusations often follow. To some rulers, the Templars were no longer holy protectors. They were creditors with crosses, and that made them far more dangerous than any army. Gold alone does not explain the fear the Templars inspired near the end. Wealth can be seized, armies can be defeated, but rumors began to circulate that the order guarded something else entirely, something less visible and far more unsettling. Whispers followed the Templars wherever they went, hints that their true treasure was not locked in vaults. The roots of these rumors stretched back to Jerusalem, to the Temple Mount itself. The Templars had been granted quarters on one of the most sacred sites on earth, a place layered with ancient history, lost texts, and forbidden traditions. For years, they remained there with little explanation, conducting activities no chronicler fully recorded. As their power grew, so did speculation. Some claimed they possessed relics that challenged established doctrine. Others believed they had uncovered knowledge older than Christianity itself, truths that could destabilize the church's authority if revealed. These ideas were never officially confirmed, but they were never fully denied either. What troubled observers most was the church's tolerance. If the Templars were merely bankers and soldiers, why grant them such unusual freedoms? Why allow secrecy within an institution that demanded obedience? And on transparency, silence often feeds suspicion, and in the church's silence only sharpened the question. By the time the order fell, many believed the Templars had been guarding something too dangerous to name openly. Whether that belief was true mattered less than its consequences. In history, the perception of forbidden knowledge can be as powerful as the knowledge itself, and for the Templars, the perception may have sealed their fate. When the Knights Templar first arrived in Jerusalem in 1119, they were few in number and strangely inactive. 9 knights, according to most chronicles, took residence on the Temple Mount, housed within the ruins, believed to stand atop the remains of Solomon's temple. For nearly a decade, they fought no major battles, escorted no caravans, and left behind almost no written explanation of their daily activities. For an order founded during a time of constant warfare, their silence was unsettling. The location itself raised questions. The Temple Mount was one of the most sacred and restricted sites in the medieval world, layered with Jewish, Christian, and Islamic history. Granting any military order exclusive access to it was extraordinary. Granting them long-term residence beneath it was unprecedented. Chroniclers mention storage rooms, stables, and chambers, but they do not explain why 9 knights required such a vast underground complex. What they were doing during those 9 years remains undocumented, yet absence of records does not mean absence of activity. Archaeological hints, later legends, and circumstantial evidence suggest the Templars were excavating. Tunnels beneath the mount existed long before modern archaeology, and medieval builders were capable of extensive underground work. The Templars had the manpower, the time, and the motive. What they might have been searching for is where mystery replaces history. Some speculate relics connected to biblical tradition. Others point to ancient texts hidden during earlier conquests. The lack of conflict during this period suggests their mission was not defensive. It was deliberate, focused, and secret. When the Templars finally emerged from Jerusalem as a powerful, wealthy order, their transformation seemed sudden. They were no longer obscure knights. They were organized, confident, and unusually well-funded. Something had changed beneath the Temple Mount, and whatever happened there was never recorded openly. That silence would echo for centuries. As the Templars spread across Europe, stories followed them like shadows. Whispers circulated in monasteries, courts, and marketplaces, claiming the order had uncovered something extraordinary in Jerusalem. Ancient scrolls, lost relics, knowledge deliberately buried to protect the foundations of faith. These stories were never endorsed by the church, but what unsettled later historians was that they were never forcefully denied either. Medieval institutions were quick to suppress dangerous rumors. Heretical ideas were condemned swiftly, texts burned publicly, and beliefs erased by decree. Yet when it came to the Templars, the Vatican remained careful. No official statement addressed what the order may or may not have found beneath the Temple Mount. Silence persisted even as legends multiplied. Some accounts claimed the Templars discovered documents predating Christian scripture, offering alternate versions of sacred history. Others suggested relics tied not to Christ's divinity, but to his humanity. objects that could destabilize doctrine if authenticated. These claims appeared in different regions, separated by geography but united by theme. What gives these legends weight is their persistence. They survived the order's destruction, resurfacing in later centuries among scholars, secret societies, and fringe theologians. Each retelling shifted details but preserved the core idea. The Templars had uncovered something the Church chose not to discuss openly. The Vatican's archives contain no public rebuttal to these stories, no theological corrections, no formal denials. For historians, this absence is striking. In an institution defined by doctrine, silence can be as meaningful as proclamation. Whether the legends were exaggerated or grounded in truth, the Church's refusal to address them allowed mystery to flourish unchecked. At the heart of the Templar mystery lies a more unsettling possibility, that whatever they uncovered did not merely challenge church politics, but church theology itself. The idea is not that the Templars rejected Christianity, but that they encountered knowledge older than it, traditions that predated the Church's authority and complicated its origin story. Jerusalem was not just a Christian city, it was ancient long before Christianity existed. Civilizations rose and fell there, leaving behind beliefs, texts, and symbols absorbed, adapted, or erased by later faiths. If the Templars encountered records from these earlier traditions, the implications would have been profound. Such knowledge would not necessarily deny Christianity, but it could reframe it. It might suggest continuity instead of divine rupture, evolution instead of revelation. For an institution built on sacred authority, this was dangerous territory. Control over interpretation was as important as belief itself. This possibility may explain the Vatican's restraint. Suppressing heresy was easy. Suppressing complexity was harder. If the Templars had touched truths that could not be unlearned, silence may have seemed safer than exposure. Whether real or imagined, the idea that the Templars encountered pre-Christian knowledge refuses to fade. It lingers because it strikes at a deeper anxiety, that history is layered, faith is inherited, and some truths are buried not because they are false, but because they are too disruptive to reveal. Among all the charges leveled against the Knights Templar, none proved more enduring or sensational than the accusation of idol worship. At the center of this claim stood a mysterious name, Baphomet. Medieval records described it vaguely, inconsistently, and often incoherently. Some witnesses claimed it was a bearded head. Others said it had 3 faces, or that it spoke, or that it granted wealth and protection. No 2 descriptions ever fully matched. This inconsistency should have raised immediate suspicion. In other heresy trials of the period, forbidden objects were clearly identified, displayed, and destroyed. In the Templars' case, no physical idol was ever produced. Everything depended on testimony, much of it extracted under extreme pressure. Linguistic confusion compounded the problem. Many historians now believe the word Baphomet itself was not a proper name, but a corrupted term, possibly derived from Mahomet, a medieval reference to Islam, or from misunderstood Eastern words encountered during the Crusades. The Templars' long presence in the Holy Land exposed them to unfamiliar cultures, languages, and symbols. What inquisitors interpreted as blasphemy may have been ritual shorthand, misunderstood gestures, or even deliberate distortions shaped by interrogators seeking confirmation rather than truth. Some confessions referenced a head not as an idol, but as a relic, a symbolic representation common in medieval spirituality. Even contemporaries expressed doubt. Learned clergy struggled to reconcile the accusation with the order's documented devotion and discipline. Why would warriors who risked their lives for Christ secretly worship an idol that no one could clearly define? The power of the accusation lay not in evidence, but in fear. Baphomet became a vessel for anxiety, a name onto which suspicion could be poured without restraint. Over time, it hardened into myth, overshadowing the reality that the charge itself was built on fragments, mistranslations, and coercion rather than concrete proof. Beyond the accusations lay another source of unease. The symbols the Templars used openly, yet rarely explained. Their seals depicted two knights sharing a single horse, skulls resting beneath crosses, and imagery that seemed at odds with simple interpretations of Christian piety. To medieval minds attuned to symbolism, these images demanded explanation. The twin riders were officially said to represent humility and poverty, a reminder of the order's early scarcity. Yet some scholars argue it symbolized duality, monk and warrior, faith and force, obedience and independence. The skull, often associated with mortality and contemplation, took on darker interpretations when paired with secrecy. To outsiders, it hinted at forbidden rites or death-centered beliefs. What is striking is not that these symbols existed, but that the Church never clarified them publicly. Ecclesiastical authorities understood symbolic language well. They routinely issued explanations for imagery that risked misinterpretation. With the Templars, they did not. No official catechism addressed their seals. No papal decree redefined their meaning. This silence allowed speculation to flourish. Symbols detached from explanation invite projection, and enemies were eager to fill the gaps. Over time, benign meanings were recast as sinister, reinforcing narratives of hidden heresy. It is possible the Church viewed these symbols as internal matters, not requiring public scrutiny. It is also possible that explaining them would raise more questions than it answered. In an age where symbols carried power, choosing not to explain them was itself a decision, one that left the Templars vulnerable to interpretations they could no longer control. When the trials intensified, confession became the currency of guilt. Under medieval law, torture was a sanctioned tool, justified as a means of extracting truth from the stubborn or deceitful. The Templars were subjected to it extensively. Under such conditions, words lose reliability. Pain reshapes memory, and survival becomes the priority. Many knights confessed to whatever their interrogator suggested. Others retracted those confessions as soon as the torture stopped. Some confessed one day and denied everything the next. The record is chaotic, filled with contradictions that troubled even contemporary observers. Earlier church investigations, conducted before royal pressure escalated, painted a different picture. In regions where torture was limited or absent, Templars overwhelmingly denied the charges. Local clergy often found no evidence of heresy. These findings were quietly sidelined as the trials progressed. The pattern is unmistakable. Confessions aligned closely with the methods used to obtain them. Where pain was applied, guilt appeared. Where it was not, innocence persisted. For historians, this discrepancy undermines the credibility of the entire case. Yet those confessions achieved their purpose. They justified dissolution, executions, and confiscations. Long after the screams faded, the written words remained, fossilized into official records. The doubt they inspired, however, never disappeared. It lingers as a reminder that truth extracted by force is rarely truth at all. Publicly, Pope Pope Clement V appeared cautious, indecisive, even weak, but behind closed doors, his actions told a different story. As pressure from King Philip IV mounted, the Pope quietly pursued his own investigation into the Knights Templar, one that did not rely on tortured confessions or royal prosecutors. He summoned senior Templar leaders, questioned them personally, and evaluated evidence that never reached public courts. What emerged from these private inquiries was not the image of a heretical cult, but of an order damaged by secrecy, internal flaws, and political enemies. Clement found no proof that the Templars had abandoned Christianity or embraced forbidden worship. Their rituals, while unconventional, did not amount to doctrinal betrayal. To the Pope, this distinction mattered deeply. Yet Clement ruled in a dangerous moment. He was a pope without Rome, ruling from Avignon, politically dependent on the French crown. Philip IV was not merely accusing the Templars. He was demanding action. Openly defying the king risked schism, violence, and the collapse of papal authority itself. So Clement made a decision that history would only uncover centuries later. He absolved the Templars of heresy in secret, not through a public bull, not through proclamation, but through private judgment. The order, in his eyes, was flawed but not damned. This verdict placed Clement in an impossible position. Declaring the Templars innocent would ignite a direct confrontation with France. Declaring them guilty would violate his conscience and the evidence before him. The compromise he chose was silence. That silence preserved the Church's stability at the cost of the order's survival. Clement did not save the Templars publicly, but he refused to condemn them spiritually. In that quiet absolution lies one of the most haunting paradoxes of medieval history. An order destroyed by the world, yet forgiven by the man who mattered most. For centuries, Pope Clement VI's true position remained hidden, buried deep within the Vatican's vast archives. Then, in the early 21st century, historians rediscovered a document that forced a reevaluation of everything believed about the Templars' fate. Known as the Chinon Parchment, it recorded a papal commission sent to interrogate the order's leaders in 1308. The parchment revealed that Jacques de Molay and other senior Templars confessed not to heresy, but to minor ritual improprieties committed under pressure and secrecy. More importantly, it showed that Clement V granted them absolution. They were reconciled with the Church, restored to communion, and forgiven of their alleged sins. This was not rumor or legend. It was official papal documentation bearing seals, signatures, and legal language unmistakable in its intent. The Templars at the highest level were never condemned by the Pope. They were forgiven. The implications were staggering. If the order was absolved, then the narrative of universal guilt collapsed. The trials, executions, and dissolutions were no longer acts of religious justice, but of political necessity. The Church had known this and had allowed history to proceed otherwise. Why was the Chinon Parchment hidden? The answer lies in its danger. Revealing it at the time would have undermined the king's case and exposed the Church's fragile position. Silence protected institutional survival. When the document resurfaced, it did not rewrite history overnight, but it confirmed what many had long suspected. The Templars were destroyed not because they were heretics, but because they were inconvenient. And the proof had been there all along, waiting quietly in the dark. Absolution should have ended the story. In another age, it might have, but the early 14th century was not a time for moral clarity. It was a time of power, debt, and fear. Pope Clement V understood that truth alone could not resolve the crisis unfolding around the Templars. Announcing their innocence would have humiliated the French crown and destabilized Christendom. It could have triggered open conflict between church and state, fractured alliances, and invited rebellion. The cost of truth was too high, so the absolution remained buried. The order was dissolved not as heretical, but as no longer necessary, a careful legal fiction that avoided theological contradiction. This allowed kings to seize assets while the church avoided openly condemning what it had quietly forgiven. Silence became a strategy, not because the truth was unknown, but because it was dangerous. By saying nothing, the Vatican preserved its authority, even as it sacrificed the order it once empowered. This decision haunts the historical record. It suggests that institutions do not always suppress truth out of malice, but out of survival. The Templars paid the price for a secret too disruptive to reveal, and in that buried absolution lies the core of the mystery. Not that the church denied the truth, but that it never needed to. Silence did the work just as effectively. By the early 14th century, Philip V of France ruled a kingdom stretched thin by ambition. His wars against England and Flanders had drained royal coffers, and repeated attempts to raise funds through taxation and currency debasement only deepened public resentment. Behind the image of a powerful monarch stood a king drowning in debt, and at the center of that debt stood the Knights Templar. The Templars were not merely lenders to the crown, they were its financial backbone. Royal treasure was stored in their vaults. State revenues passed through their hands. Loans were extended not once, but repeatedly, as Philip's campaigns grew more expensive and less successful. Unlike ordinary creditors, the Templars could not be bullied, taxed, or easily ignored. They kept meticulous records, and debts to them did not fade with time. This imbalance gnawed at the king. A monarch who owed vast sums to a religious order found his authority quietly undermined. The Templars did not flaunt their power, but they did not relinquish it either. They had become indispensable, and dependence breeds resentment faster than open rivalry. Philip had faced financial crises before. He had expelled Jews from France to seize their assets. He had targeted Lombard bankers when they became inconvenient. Each time, accusation preceded confiscation. The pattern was familiar. When debt could not be repaid, it was erased through force and justification. The Templars, however, posed a unique challenge. Their wealth was protected by the church. Their independence shielded them from royal courts. As long as they existed, Philip's debt remained a reminder of his vulnerability. Eliminating the order would not only erase what he owed, but transfer their assets into royal hands. In this light, the sudden charges of heresy take on a colder logic. Financial desperation has rewritten history before, and in Philip's case, it provided both motive and urgency. What followed was not the collapse of a holy order, but the resolution of a king's debt through destruction. The trial of the Knights Templar bore the outward shape of religious justice, but its engine was political power. Philip IV did not wait for papal approval before acting. He moved first, arrested en masse, and presented the church with a crisis already in motion. The message was clear: resist and risk chaos. Royal officials controlled the narrative from the beginning. Charges were drafted, interrogations conducted, and confessions recorded under royal authority. The church was invited to participate, but only after conclusions had been framed. What should have been a theological inquiry became a spectacle managed by the crown. Legal norms were bent, then broken, Witnesses were selected carefully. Evidence flowed in one direction. When papal commissions produced findings favorable to the Templars, they were delayed, dismissed, or ignored. The appearance of due process masked a predetermined outcome. Philip understood the power of heresy as a weapon. It transformed financial conflict into moral outrage. It turned creditors into enemies of God. Once the accusation took hold, defending the Templars became politically dangerous. Any resistance could be framed as sympathy for blasphemy. The church found itself cornered. To oppose the king risked open confrontation. To comply meant endorsing a process it did not fully control. The compromise was reluctant participation, allowing the trial to proceed while preserving technical distance. In the end, the verdict mattered less than the effect. The order was dismantled, its leaders imprisoned or executed, its assets redistributed. The trial achieved its true purpose without ever admitting it. What appeared to be a battle over faith was, at its core, a struggle over power and debt, dressed carefully in the language of salvation. The destruction of the Knights Templar marked a turning point in medieval history. It was a moment when the authority of kings visibly overshadowed the moral voice of the church, not through open defiance, but through pressure, leverage, and inevitability. Pope Clement V did not declare the Templars heretics. He dissolved the order quietly, citing prudence rather than guilt. This distinction mattered, but it also revealed the limits of spiritual authority in a political world. Faith alone could not protect an institution that had become inconvenient to power. For contemporaries, the lesson was unsettling. If an order so favored by the church could be erased, then no protection was absolute. Kings had learned that religious institutions could be bent without breaking doctrine openly. Silence and legal ambiguity could achieve what force alone usually could not. The Templars became collateral damage in a larger struggle. Their fall signaled a new reality, one where survival depended less on righteousness than on alignment with power. The church preserved itself by yielding, and in doing so, revealed the fragile boundary between belief and politics. This moment lingers because it feels uncomfortably familiar. It reminds us that truth does not always prevail when it threatens stability. Sometimes it is buried, postponed, or quietly set aside. The suppression of the Templars was not only the end of an order, it was a demonstration of how easily faith can be overshadowed when power demands compliance, and how history is shaped not by what is proven, but by what is allowed to survive. In the days leading up to October 13, 1307, something unusual was happening along the French coast. Templar ports, normally busy but predictable, showed signs of quiet urgency. Ships were loaded without ceremony. Records were left incomplete. Then, just before the arrests began, the fleets were gone. No royal orders authorized their departure. No storms explained their disappearance. They simply vanished. The Knights Templar maintained one of the most capable naval networks in medieval Europe. Their ships moved pilgrims, treasure, and messages between continents with efficiency rivaling any crown. They knew the seas well, and more importantly, they knew when danger was coming. The mass arrests required secrecy, but secrecy is fragile. Whispers travel faster than royal decrees. When Philip IV's men stormed Templar properties inland, they found vaults lighter than expected. Treasures were missing. Documents had been removed. And along the coast, harbors stood empty. Chroniclers noticed. So did royal accountants. Where the ships went remains uncertain. Some speculate they sailed to Scotland beyond papal reach. Others suggest Portugal or the Mediterranean, where Templar influence was strong. There are even rumors of Atlantic crossings. Though evidence thins quickly there, what matters is not the destination, but the timing. The disappearance suggests foresight. Either the Templars anticipated their downfall, or someone warned them. Both possibilities challenge the idea of a surprised, guilty order. Fleets do not vanish by accident, they leave with purpose. No official investigation followed. The king seized what remained and moved on. The church asked no public questions. The ships and whatever they carried passed into legend. But their absence left behind a quiet implication. The Templars may have escaped not only arrest, but complete destruction, slipping away under cover of night while history watched the wrong doors. As the order collapsed in France, reports emerged of Templars surviving elsewhere, protected by distance, politics, or silence. Scotland became one of the earliest candidates. At the time, it was excommunicated and hostile to English and papal authority. Royal writ did not easily reach its borders. Templars arriving there would have found a land beyond immediate scrutiny. Portugal offered an even clearer refuge. King Denis the Murros refused to persecute the Templars outright. Instead, he reorganized them under a new name, the Order of Christ, preserving their lands, members, and influence. This was done openly with papal approval. The order disappeared on paper, but its structure remained intact. Elsewhere, similar patterns appeared. In remote regions of Spain, Germany, and Eastern Europe, former Templars faded quietly into local orders or estates. Some retained their roles as soldiers, others became administrators or monks. Their identities dissolved, but their networks endured. What is striking is the lack of investigation. The Church, meticulous in rooting out heresy, showed little interest in pursuing these remnants. No systematic trials followed. No coordinated effort tracked former members. It was as if survival, not guilt, was being tolerated. This selective blindness suggests compromise. The Church may have understood that the order was not heretical, only politically unsustainable. Allowing fragments to survive avoided further conflict while maintaining plausible deniability. In these safe havens, the Templars did not rise again as an order, but neither did they vanish completely. They adapted, blended, and endured. History remembers their destruction, but it rarely accounts for the quiet places where that destruction never fully reached. In the years after the Templars' dissolution, new orders appeared across Europe, bearing striking similarities to the one that had supposedly been erased. They inherited Templar lands. They absorbed former members. Their rules echoed familiar structures. Officially, these were new institutions. Unofficially, they felt like continuations. The Order of Christ in Portugal was the most obvious example. Its leadership, assets, and mission closely mirrored those of the Templars. It operated with papal blessing and later played a central role in Portugal's age of exploration, funded by wealth that once belonged to the fallen order. Elsewhere, military orders adopted Templar properties with little explanation. Symbols changed, but hierarchies remained. Knowledge was passed quietly, without ceremony. The Vatican sanctioned these transitions carefully, avoiding attention while ensuring continuity. This pattern suggests intention rather than coincidence. If the Templars were truly heretical, their legacy would have been erased completely. Instead, it was redistributed, rebranded, and preserved. The Church never announced these connections, but it never denied them either. In silence, structure survived. The order died publicly, yet lived on institutionally. This raises a final, unsettling possibility. The Templars were not destroyed, but transformed. Their name became too dangerous to keep, but their function remained useful. And so, history records an ending, while the truth may have been something far quieter, a disappearance that was also an escape. As the physical order faded from public view, a different kind of legacy began to take shape around the Knights Templar, one rooted not in battles or banking, but in knowledge. Stories emerged linking the Templars to traditions that operated beneath the surface of medieval Christianity. Sacred geometry, ancient mathematics, and symbolic systems inherited from civilizations far older than Europe itself. The Templars had traveled extensively through regions where Greek, Islamic, and Jewish scholars preserved sciences long forgotten in the West. In the Holy Land, they encountered advanced architectural principles, astronomical calculations, and philosophical texts translated and safeguarded by Islamic scholars. These ideas were not mystical fantasies. They were practical sciences that Europe had lost during centuries of instability. Templar churches reflected this influence. Many were built with precise geometric ratios, aligned with solstices, cardinal directions, and celestial events. Such accuracy was not accidental. Sacred geometry treated architecture as a language, one that encoded meaning through proportion and form. To those who understood it, buildings became texts written in stone. Critics argue these connections are exaggerated, but the consistency is difficult to ignore. The same symbolic patterns appear repeatedly across Templar sites, separated by vast distances. This suggests shared knowledge transmitted deliberately, not coincidence. What unsettled later authorities was not the existence of this knowledge, but its source. If the Templars acted as conduits for ancient sciences, they challenged the idea that truth flowed exclusively through the church. Knowledge, once decentralized, becomes harder to control. Whether the Templars consciously preserved forbidden wisdom or simply applied what they learned, their reputation became inseparable from the idea of hidden traditions. Even after their fall, that reputation endured because it addressed a deeper suspicion that history contained streams of knowledge deliberately diverted, guarded by those who understood their power. If the Templars truly trafficked in dangerous knowledge, one might expect the Church to condemn it fiercely. Yet no such condemnation ever came. The ideas associated with the order were never formally labeled heretical. Instead, many quietly survived within Christian institutions themselves. Sacred geometry did not disappear after the Templars. It flourished. Cathedrals built long after their fall continued to use the same proportional systems, alignments, and symbolic layouts. Monastic schools taught mathematical principles inherited from classical sources. Even astronomical observation remained essential to calculating religious calendars. This continuity reveals an uncomfortable truth. The Church relied on the very knowledge it was suspected of suppressing. Condemning the Templars' intellectual legacy outright would have required condemning tools the Church itself used daily. By remaining silent, the Vatican avoided contradiction. Ideas were absorbed, normalized, and stripped of controversial associations. What was once rumored to be forbidden became acceptable once detached from the Templar name. This strategy preserved authority while avoiding confrontation. It allowed the Church to benefit from inherited knowledge without acknowledging its transmission through an order that had become politically toxic. Condemnation would have drawn attention. Silence allowed assimilation. Over time, the origins of these ideas blurred, their pathways forgotten. What mattered was not who preserved them, but who controlled their interpretation. This explains the absence of theological outrage. The danger was not the knowledge itself, but its independence. Once reintegrated under ecclesiastical oversight, it ceased to be threatening. The Church did not erase the Templars' ideas because erasing them was impossible. Instead, it absorbed them quietly, ensuring continuity without credit and authority without exposure. Long after the order was dissolved, its influence remained embedded in the structures of Europe. Banking systems developed by the Templars continued under new names. Letters of credit, standardized accounting, and transnational finance became permanent features of European power. Architectural echoes persisted as well. Churches, fortresses, and civic buildings mirrored designs first popularized by Templar builders. Geometry, symbolism, and spatial discipline endured, even as their origins faded from memory. More subtly, the idea of centralized, disciplined institutions operating beyond local rule survived. Later organizations adopted similar models, balancing secrecy with structure, loyalty with efficiency. These were not revivals of the Templars, but reflections of their success. The order's greatest legacy may have been institutional rather than ideological. It proved that power could be organized without bloodline, that loyalty could transcend borders, and that knowledge could be protected through structure rather than force. History remembers the Templars as victims or villains. It rarely acknowledges them as architects of systems that still shape the modern world. Yet their influence lingers quietly, not in conspiracy, but in continuity. What refuses to vanish is not a secret society, but an idea that some legacies survive destruction by adapting, embedding themselves so deeply into society that they no longer need names. Deep within the Vatican lie archives that stretch for miles, shelves upon shelves of parchment, correspondence, trial records, and private judgments accumulated over centuries. Access to these archives has always been selective, controlled, and deliberate, while portions have been open to scholars in recent decades. Significant sections remain restricted, including materials related to sensitive political and theological crises. Among the most requested and most elusive are documents connected to the Knights Templar. Historians know these records exist because they are referenced indirectly. Inventories mention commissions, letters, and transcripts that never appear publicly. Papal correspondence hints at debates and decisions that were never announced. What survives is fragmented, carefully curated, and often stripped of context. What remains hidden invites speculation, not because it must contain scandal, but because of its deliberate absence. The Vatican has long argued that restrictions are necessary to preserve fragile documents or protect incomplete records from misinterpretation. Yet other equally fragile materials have been released. The selectivity fuels suspicion. If the Templars were fully condemned, why maintain secrecy? If the case was settled, why protect the paperwork? The rediscovery of the Chinon Parchment demonstrated what such archives can reveal when opened. A single document overturned centuries of assumptions. That precedent alone suggests other revelations may still be buried. What historians are denied is not proof of conspiracy, but completeness. Without full access, interpretation remains provisional. Silence fills the gaps where evidence should be. In history, control of archives is control of narrative. By choosing what may be seen and what must remain hidden, institutions shape memory itself. The locked doors of the Vatican archives are not accusations, but they are invitations to question why some stories are still considered too dangerous to tell. Even with modern scholarship and partial disclosures, the Templar story remains riddled with unanswered questions. These are not marginal details. They are contradictions that strike at the heart of the official narrative, and yet they have never been addressed directly by the Church. Why were the Templars absolved privately but destroyed publicly? Why were some confessions accepted while others, obtained without torture, ignored? Why did papal investigations yield different conclusions from royal trials? These discrepancies were known at the time, not discovered later, and still no unified explanation exists. Another question lingers over the order's dissolution. If heresy was proven, why dissolve the Templars through administrative decree rather than theological condemnation? Heretical groups were traditionally excommunicated and denounced. The Templars were quietly disbanded, their guilt implied but never formally declared. Then there is the issue of survival. Why were successor orders permitted to inherit Templar assets and personnel? Why were former members absorbed rather than hunted? These choices contradict the logic of total eradication. Most striking is the absence of denial. At no point has the Vatican issued a comprehensive statement clarifying the contradictions, correcting misconceptions, or closing the matter definitively. Instead, history has been allowed to settle into ambiguity. This matters because institutions that command moral authority rely on clarity. When silence replaces explanation, it invites alternative interpretations. Doubt fills the vacuum left by unanswered questions. The unresolved nature of the Templar affair suggests not oversight, but avoidance. Some contradictions may resist resolution because acknowledging them would expose uncomfortable truths about power, compromise, and the limits of spiritual authority. Silence is often mistaken for neutrality, but in history it frequently functions as strategy. The Vatican never issued a sweeping denial of the deeper Templar mysteries. It never fully endorsed them either. Instead, it allowed time to erode urgency, letting questions fade into background noise. This approach assumes something crucial, that denial would draw more attention than silence. To argue against an accusation is to validate its relevance. By saying nothing, the Church avoided amplifying speculation. The result was not resolution, but endurance. For centuries, the absence of denial allowed legends to persist, not because they were proven, but because they were never challenged. This creates an unsettling possibility. Perhaps the Church did not dispute certain claims because it did not need to. Some truths may have been acknowledged internally, accepted as complex rather than dangerous. Silence can also reflect agreement on fundamentals. The Vatican did not contest the idea that the Templars were unjustly accused. It did not deny their absolution. It simply refrained from publicizing it. In this light, silence becomes a quiet admission, not of conspiracy, but of unresolved reality. History was allowed to remember the Templars as it would while the Church preserved its stability. What remains is not proof, but pattern. When institutions refuse to speak, they leave interpretation to others, and sometimes the most revealing answer is not what is sovereign, but what is left unsaid, echoing across centuries without correction. The truth about the Knights Templar lies in a space history often struggles to occupy, between innocence and guilt. They were not simple victims, nor were they the heretics history once painted them to be. The order was powerful, secretive, and structurally dangerous to medieval authority, but that danger was political, not theological. The Templars accumulated wealth, influence, and independence on a scale that unsettled kings and complicated the Church's hierarchy. They operated across borders, answered only to the Pope, and maintained secrecy as a matter of discipline rather than deception. In a world where power demanded visibility and control, this made them threatening. Their rituals, symbols, and internal rules departed from public norms. But secrecy alone does not equal heresy. Medieval institutions often guarded knowledge carefully, especially those tasked with protection, finance, and diplomacy. What set the Templars apart was not what they believed, but how insulated they became from oversight. They were guilty of being indispensable, guilty of holding debts kings could not repay, guilty of existing outside the traditional chains of command. These were not crimes against faith, but against power. At the same time, the order was not blameless. Their secrecy invited suspicion. Their refusal to explain themselves made them easy targets. By operating beyond transparency, they allowed others to define their story when the moment turned against them. History often prefers clear villains and pure martyrs. The Templars were neither. They were an institution that outgrew the tolerance of its age, condemned not for what it preached, but for what it represented. In that distinction lies the most honest conclusion. The Knights Templar were destroyed not because they betrayed Christianity, but because they complicated it. And in a fragile medieval world, complexity was a liability no powerful institution was allowed to survive. If the Vatican knew the Templars were not heretics, why did it never correct the record completely? The answer lies not in malice, but in consequence. To deny the charges publicly would have required admitting something far more dangerous, that the church could be coerced by secular power. A full denial would have exposed the limits of papal authority. It would have revealed that kings could dictate outcomes through pressure, debt, and force. Such an admission threatened the Church's moral supremacy far beyond the Templar case. Acknowledging the truth would also have raised questions about other compromises quietly made throughout history. The Templars were not an isolated incident. They were a visible fracture in the illusion of absolute spiritual control. Silence allowed the Vatican to preserve continuity. By avoiding confrontation, it protected the institution even as it sacrificed an order it had once empowered. This was not justice, but survival. There was also the problem of precedent. If one suppressed truth was admitted, others would follow. Archives would be questioned, decisions revisited, authority weakened by doubt. Instead, the Church chose ambiguity. It absolved privately, dissolved administratively, and allowed public memory to settle into confusion. This approach avoided direct falsehood while never embracing full transparency. The Vatican never fully denied the deeper truths, because doing so would have required speaking about things it could not safely control. Power, once revealed as negotiable, loses its mystique. In this sense, silence was not cowardice, but calculation. The truth survived, but only in fragments preserved by scholars, documents, and unanswered questions rather than proclamation. It remains intact precisely because it was never fully spoken. Centuries later, the Knights Templar continued to occupy a strange place in history. They are not merely remembered. They are watched, revisited, and reinterpreted as if their story refuses to remain finished. Part of this endurance comes from what was left unresolved. Questions unanswered do not fade, they wait. The Templars represent a moment when power, faith, and truth diverged, leaving behind a narrative shaped by silence rather than certainty. Their legacy is not a secret society hidden in shadows, but a warning embedded in history. Institutions can be destroyed without being wrong. Truth can survive without being spoken. Authority can prevail without being just. Modern systems of finance, bureaucracy, and transnational power echo structures the Templars pioneered. Their influence persists not as conspiracy, but as inheritance. Ideas outlast names. What unsettles us is not what the Templars might have known, but what their fate reveals about how history is written. Not by evidence alone, but by those who control outcomes. The mystery still watches because it reflects something ongoing, the tension between truth and stability, between silence and exposure, between what is known privately and what is allowed publicly. The Knights Templar were erased, but the questions they left behind were not. They remain quiet and patient, reminding us that history is not always about what happened, but about what was permitted to be remembered.